you very much. Thank you very much. Professor Kennedy, thank you for your leadership here. I know Professor Brick is here. Thank you for helping get us started so many years ago. Thank you, President Deek, for your wonderful remarks. I want to thank our Charge and the interim U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, Reese Smith, who's here, the board members, the Chairman Ted Smith, and the other members of the board, members of the faculty, and the students in the Clinton Institute. I did have a good time talking to them. They're from Ireland, America, Kurdistan, St. Petersburg, France. I have a speech today that I worked hard on. You know, the great thing about being president or not being president is that you can say whatever you want. The sad thing is nobody has to pay any attention to you anymore. But I have written this out. So I will depart from my normal practice and put my glasses on because I want to say this as carefully as I can. But I'll give you most of the end at the beginning. UCD is a metaphor for the way the world ought to work. 25% of your students are international, 35% of your faculty is international, 50% of your researchers are international, and nobody doubts this is Ireland. I passed the playing fields coming in. It's an Irish place. You have a Taoiseach who's half Indian and gay. Nobody doubts he's Irish. The great struggle of the 21st century has turned out to be one over identity, the oldest struggle of humanity. Who am I? How do I relate to you? How do I relate to any other entities? The Irish peace agreement is a metaphor for how to get from here to there. And there is the way you live and take for granted every day. The world has never been more full of possibility. This ought to be the most prosperous, interesting, fascinating time in all of human history. If we were averse to self-inflicted wounds, our biggest problem would be climate change, and we'd get everybody together and figure out how to deal with it. It too is a self-inflicted wound, but it happened over hundreds of years, although mostly since 1950. The fact that it's not brings increasing importance to observing this anniversary and what to do about it. Now, at my age, I am well aware of the tendency of people who are fortunate enough to live a certain number of years to spend all their time reminiscing. And the sanctimonious among us are wont to say that we did it right and you're doing it wrong. I thankfully am free of all that because I have two fabulous grandchildren, a brilliant daughter, a wonderful son-in-law, and a wife who bears the scars of fighting for the future. In my family, we try always to think about tomorrow. And my argument to you today is that it's worth looking back at the Good Friday Accord because it tells us so much about how we might go forward together. I'll never forget, it's true that on the night of April 9th, 20 years ago, I was up till 2:30 in the morning. I had to talk to Jerry Adams, and I had to talk to David Trimble, and to Bertie Ahern, and to Tony Blair, and to George Mitchell, and I went to bed at 2:30. And at 5 o'clock, he called me again. Said, you got to make 2 more calls. I said, damn it, George, I just spent up all night. He said, you're the person who gave me this part-time job. You swore it was a part-time job. We might as well make the best of it. In 2001, I came here for a dinner celebrating what became the Clinton Institute at UCD. The Irish government had voted to fund an institute in recognition of the role the United States had played in the Irish peace process. And they had not yet settled on where it would be. But Bertie Ahern, still the Taoiseach, said, we're going to have a celebratory dinner. And he complained because I said, well, I have to fly out and I have to be gone by 2. So we have to finish at 1:15. He said, the Irish cannot give you a proper celebratory dinner unless we go on till 15 minutes to 3 in the morning. He was dead serious. I said, Bertie, we'll just have to cram it in. And I'll never forget, Richard Harris was still alive and read poetry. John Hurt was there just in attendance because he wanted to be there. The Vard sisters sang, the Irish tenors sang. A wonderful young woman named Diane Nalini sang. Bono introduced me with his wife less than 24 hours after their last child was born. It was your typical Irish event. Senator Gary Hart was doing some kind of extra study somewhere in Dublin, and he came. It was an amazing thing. I remember everything about it. Now, that time, it was sort of fun staying up half the night, but I felt bad that I cheated Bertie Ahern out of an hour and a half of celebration. Then 20 years ago, when we did stay up till 2:30, we wound up with a fine piece of work. And I'll say more about it in a moment. We live in an increasingly interdependent world. It was an inevitable thing that with the economy changing so fast, and I hope just temporarily leaving plenty of people behind as people with good educations, well-positioned, moved ahead. And with so many identity categories being changed so rapidly at once in so many societies, that there would be a reaction. It didn't have to be as severe as it's turned out to be. But basically, if you believe the world is a hopeful place that can accommodate universal empowerment, universal access to economic improvement, universal access to social equality, and a sense of political equality, then it's easy to believe that economics, politics, and social policy are positive-sum games. That is, creative cooperation works better than constant conflict because we can all win. If, on the other hand, you believe that the economy, social standing, and political participation is a static pie, then you're prone to just try to get a bigger piece and to look at everybody who has a bigger piece as someone who's hurting you. So you have to take from them to do better yourself. And so you believe it's a zero-sum game, where in order for someone to win, someone else has to lose. And we all want to be winners. And that quickly devolves into the oldest conflict of human society, us versus them. My identity is so separate from yours that what separates us is far more important than what we have in common. And in a funny way, that's basically what the Good Friday Accord had to confront. The people in Northern Ireland had grown weary of violence. They'd grown weary of killing. They'd grown weary of economic deprivation born of a dog-eat-dog world. Young people felt no need to look down on other young people who were in other communities. Women's groups got organized. Instead, they didn't want their children and grandchildren to die prematurely, or to grow up with friends who died prematurely, and to take the arbitrariness of all political violence as a given in life. And for many people who know what happened, the Good Friday Accord remains a beacon of hope, something that has great implications for the future of Northern Ireland, this republic, Europe, and hopefully for the larger world. But, as always, people in a position to influence what happens have to decide what to do with it. It happened, the process did, shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the bipolar world. It was obvious that the triumph of freedom, democracy, and free markets would lead to a new era, but would it be a new era of peace and broadly shared prosperity? Or would it simply rip the cover off of long-standing grievances? Or make new kinds of conflicts within and between nation states more likely? When I ran for president, I was well aware that both outcomes were possible. And one of the reasons I ran was to make sure we maximized the possibility of the good outcomes and minimize the probability of the destructive ones. I first became captivated by the struggles of Northern Ireland when I was a student at Oxford and the Troubles began in 1969. It was there that I came to understand the nature of the grievances, the political, economic, social, and deeply personal psychological dimensions of the conflict. And I wanted someday, because of my Irish roots on my mother's side, to see it come to an end. The lion's share of the credit for making it part of my presidential campaign actually belongs to the Irish American community in New York. Because shortly before the New York primary in 1992, also in this month, in April, I went to a meeting organized by the community for all the candidates for the Democratic nomination. And they were very insistent. They wanted a personal commitment from a candidate to get involved in the Irish peace process, and a personal willingness to appoint a special envoy to advance that process. Their position was simple. The Irish American diaspora had Catholics and Protestants who were both interested in an end to the conflict. We had Irish American bars, which were famous fronts for people who helped to arm the dissident groups. But we also had people who had worked for decades quietly at their own expense to try to bring an end to the violence. No previous president had done it, even President Kennedy, because they were under enormous pressure to stay out of it, because that's what the British wanted us to do. And we had what was known as a special relationship with the UK, which we had and have, and which is profoundly important to us. But I thought we should do it. And so I said I would. Not long after I left the White House, my daughter was about to graduate from Stanford. And she had taken almost a whole year off to help me in the White House while her mother was running for senator from New York. So she rushed back to Stanford and stayed up all night for 10 weeks, literally, to write an honors thesis so she could graduate with highest honors. It was on the relationship of Ireland and America. And the whole last third of the thing was about the involvement of Americans in the Irish peace process. So she sent me a copy of it, and I called her, and I said, Chelsea, just give me the bottom line. I'm going to read it, but give me the bottom line. And my sometimes painfully honest, brilliant child said, well, Dad, I really think you got into it in the beginning because you wanted to carry New York. But, she said, the deeper you got, the more committed you became, and you actually did a pretty good job. Our children sometimes keep us where we ought to be. The real credit for this peace belongs to the leaders who made the decisions along the way. To Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, and before them, John Major and Albert Reynolds and John Bruton. To David Trimble, John Hume, Jerry Adams, and many others, and to those who came after, including something I never would have believed, Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness. To the women's groups who spoke out early and often and constantly, and to the young people who wrote and pled and spoke for peace. When I spoke at Martin McGuinness's funeral last year, by the way, turned out to be an unbelievable political leader. His first job in the new government was as education minister, and he was very proud that he had allocated even more money to the poor schools in the Protestant areas than the Catholic ones, just to show them that they were serious about the peace. At the funeral, I quoted Seamus Heaney's Nobel Prize lecture, where he said the secret to success was deciding to, quote, walk on air against your better judgment. That's what they did, every one of them. And it was not free. There's a tendency in hindsight to sort of smooth out these things, like we talk about our founding fathers in America, that they were all totally enlightened and just went around hugging each other, being reasonable. But these deals require sacrifice and compromise. It's never easy, and it's not free. The dominant political parties, when the peace process began on peace, were the SDLP and the UUP. What happened to them? As soon as peace was made, people said, oh, we're stuck in this thing. We better get the toughest guys we can to make the best deal. And it helped Sinn Féin and the DUP. David Trimble was not a dummy, and John Hume certainly wasn't. They knew perfectly well that they were putting their political parties at risk, and they did it for the young people and for the future. I also think it's important, because I was joking about him early, to give credit to George Mitchell, who was a brilliant Senate Majority Leader in the United States Senate, and before that, an incredibly good United States federal judge who knew a lot about conflict because one of his parents was Irish and the other was Lebanese. The American University of Beirut in the 1960s looked sort of like this. Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East, and ethnic and religious conflicts nearly destroyed the country. Interestingly enough, they adopted a governmental structure which I think informed what George decided to do. In Beirut, in Lebanon, the winning political party gets to name the prime minister. In all but one election, that's normally the moderate Sunni party. But in one year, the Shia party won, and the political arm of Hezbollah got to name the prime minister, and they did it. They followed the rules. They stuck with their democracy. When the prime minister is a Sunni, then the head of the legislature, normally Nabi Berri, a moderate Shia, is the Speaker of the Assembly. And they have a president who's normally a Maronite Christian, and the head of the Supreme Court is normally a Druze. They share power. They share decision-making. They share responsibility for the future. And against all odds, that country is held together while being regularly abused by Syria and using the mountains to train terrorist groups and to place people back and forth, and being caught in the middle of the Israeli conflict with others. But they hung on there. And I think it had a lot to do with what George Mitchell finally decided to do in what he called the most strenuous part-time job he'd ever been given. Mitchell was also very good in recognizing that you don't get to the end at the beginning. You have to work on confidence-building measures. And he did painstaking work, along with the people who helped him on disarmament and other things, to try to get there. But the ultimate credit still belongs to ordinary citizens, because this had to be voted on. Keep in mind, it was only 6 weeks after the agreement that there was a referendum in the Irish Republic and in Northern Ireland, where the Catholic community passed it with, as I remember, almost 90% of the vote, maybe more. But the Protestant community, where there was much more controversy, because they were, after all, in the majority, passed it with a clear majority. And they did it, I believe, not only because of the courage of the politicians in their communities and people in the UK from both major parties then pushing for it, but because they knew that demographically they would someday not be in the majority anymore. The birth rate among Catholics was higher, and even more important, before the crash, there were immigrants flooding in to Northern Ireland as well as to the Republic, and it was going to change everything. And they knew that if they took this deal today and faithfully honored it, then when they were no longer in the majority, they would also be treated fairly. That was the leap they took. That was the air they walked on. And I've often thought that a lot of credit belongs to John Major, who risked his narrow parliamentary majority in 1982 to start this. And so I think sometimes the people who really stick their neck out don't get the credit that they deserve. The genius to me of the Good Friday Accord was that it was about real democracy, not just majority rule, but minority rights, individual rights, the rule of law, and the absence of violence. And I think this is profoundly important. The negotiators came up with a brilliant system of shared decision-making, shared economic benefits, shared political and social benefits, and special ties to the Irish Republic as well as to the UK. There'd never been an agreement quite like it before, although, as I said, the Lebanese resolution bore some resemblance. When it happened, people around the world had to stop and think, well, I don't want my kids to grow up with all this violence either. You mentioned Colombia, a country that I have been very involved with and was there. I try to go about once a year and keep it going. Same thing just happened there. The party that made the peace suffered setbacks in the election, although it's not clear that the party that won is committed to reversing the peace process. They just said, okay, we're stuck with this, now let's be as tough as we can. This is all natural, as long as you hold the line on democracy. So we should be very grateful, first, that this peace is held. And in this time, given what's going on around the world, we should be grateful that none of the parties ever questioned the idea that it had to be approved by a referendum and that it had to be accompanied by regular elections in the normal course of business. Because if you look around the world today, you can see that it's a fool's errand to assume that democracy will always be around, that it can't be lost. There was a fascinating article I read in a paper the other day that said, by people who've written much more about this, it said basically if you want to preserve a democratic system, it requires three things, all of which are at risk today. One, economic growth doesn't have to be spectacular, but it has to be steady and well shared. Two, a fairly high degree of social cohesion, which doesn't require racial, ethnic, religious homogeneity. In fact, some of the most socially cohesive places in America are the most diverse. But where they're working, they also have economic growth. And they have a sense of shared participation. And they have the security that what they have in common is more important than their interesting differences. And the third thing, he said, is an information ecostructure that allows people to agree on the facts so they know what they're disagreeing about. My simple example of that is we can have a real argument about what the best method to teach arithmetic to young children is, as long as we don't have to argue whether 2 + 2 is 4. But in the world we live in today, in some ecostructures, a lie works just as well as the truth, sometimes better, because you can repeat it over and over again. If you're telling the truth, you get bored saying the same thing every day and you want to say something tomorrow. So you had all that. In the worst days, you had all that. People accepted from right to left that there would be a democratic resolution of this. And there's still a lot to be done, as the current political paralysis in the North shows, and the uncertainties of Brexit show. And remembering the things I said, it bothers me that even though there is nominally a low unemployment rate in Northern Ireland too, the workforce participation rate there is much lower than it is in Ireland. And the uncertainties created by Brexit and the long absence of a standing government in the North, I have no doubt have contributed to the fact that their economic growth rate, while positive, is much lower than yours is. Because if you're a small country, you have to do business with other people and you have to have capital inflows to have significant economic growth. So, I will say the most important thing is that the peace is held and nobody has questioned democracy. But there is a political limit imposed by constant paralysis. Because even if the economy stays static, the politics don't. And that is the challenge that every one of us faces today. Who cares about this? One of the many great lines Yeats wrote was, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. It can also make a stone of the head." There is simply a limit to how long people can go on. Reconciliation, as was said earlier, is a process. It's not an event. Every time you hear some politician saying something, trying to get people all hot under the collar, I'll bet you anything, about every third sentence, somebody says, in this crowd would say, well, I can't vote for that guy, but I agree with that. In other words, we all wake up every day with a little scale inside, with hope on one side and fear on the other. We've all got something to resent. It's part of the human condition. So you got to work at it every day. You got to be willing to begin again and again and again and again. Best person I ever knew at that was Nelson Mandela. Oh, the whole world saw him as a saint, you know, because he had such high discipline. I loved him. But I saw him up close. And every now and then, somebody would say or do something stupid, and I would see momentarily this anger flare in his eyes. And all of a sudden, all those 27 years he was in jail played back to him. All of a sudden, every racist, horrible, awful thing that ever happened came into his head, and he got rid of it within 5 seconds. Because if you didn't know him, you'd never see it. But he knew that every single solitary day, he had to fight to keep hope alive, to keep reconciliation alive, to keep the idea that his country could be united alive. So my first plea is, this thing has lasted. Don't let it go. And you can't let it go by doing nothing. One of three things is going to happen in the North. The whole thing will fall apart, and you'll go back to the hell that now people have forgotten of the Troubles. Or two, you'll just stay in purgatory, where you've got denied dreams and broken hopes, and you'll just rock along, caught on a sea of lost chances. If you do that, slowly you'll begin to lose your democracy in the North. And everything that could happen in the cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic and the larger Europe and the UK. Or three, everybody can rear back, settle down, and make a new beginning. Whatever compromises have to be made to minimize the damage of Brexit, keep the markets open as possible, and share the government. It is so easy to underestimate the fragility of a system you have come to take for granted. So when, like, Brexit happens, and then you can't make a deal on these other things, and the government goes down, then everybody's temptation is to double down and bargain harder, not want to be seen making compromises. Think about what might happen to the larger politics in the Irish Republic or in the UK, the whole thing. We all do it. All politicians do things like this. You know, you open a deal, you ask for more than you think you're going to get, all that sort of stuff. But in the end, you have to be willing to give. Compromise has to become a good thing, not a dirty word. And voters have to stop punishing people who make those compromises and start rewarding them. The most important lesson of the Good Friday Accord and America's involvement in it was the simple acknowledgement that in an interdependent world, the best, most successful societies are those in which everyone is empowered with a chance to build their own lives, in which every voice is heard, in which cooperation trumps conflict, because inclusive groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones. We're not here in a graduate seminar in any kind of political science, but I could fill this room with the studies that have been done, proving that diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones, or lone geniuses. If we could miraculously find the person in this room with the highest IQ and take you to another room and give you whatever you wanted for 2 days, and the rest of us poor souls were stuck here with stale water and cold coffee, and 10 questions were fed into both rooms, after 2 days, the rest of us would make better decisions. Because we're a diverse group with different experiences, different insight, different openness. And yet, when there is paralysis, authoritarianism has its appeal. When there's no agreement on what the truth is, voters say, well, how can I make an informed decision? Let's just argue about who to be the best boss. So this whole thing in Northern Ireland is unfolding against a global backdrop in which all these forces are working. So once again, it's about the people who live there and their kids and grandkids. But it's also about you and Europe and the larger world. Zero-sum games in which there has to be a loser for every winner are great in all sports. But they are not worth a flip when it comes to making economic and social policy. And by the way, if you look at the global survey that's done every single year on the happiest countries on earth, they're not very good in terms of individual psychology either. The happiest places are places where there is broadly shared prosperity, a strong sense of cohesion, an ability to accommodate social change, and a simple conviction that compromise is honorable because what we have in common is more important than our interesting difference. The world is aching to hear this lesson again. And they want to see it here, on this small island. It will have an enormous impact. I promise you there are a lot of people around the world today who believe the economy is a fixed pie. Social standing is static. Political power is monofaceted. You either got it or you don't. They believe us versus them is not only inevitable, that it's good as long as it's us. You see it in the terror campaigns of ISIS, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram. One of the things that made me maddest about ISIS when they were riding high, quite apart from their just abject violence, is the way they went after the Yazidis and the other small religious sects in Iraq and the larger Middle East. One of the things that made me proudest was how the Kurds protected the Yazidis and others. There's still 200,000 Samaritans in the Middle East. Who cares whether they live or die? It's an important part of world history. Myanmar, we all cheered when they seemed to be less dominated by military dictatorships. Now we grieve because To many people, the Muslim Rohingyas are viewed as Bengalis, aliens, less human. We see it in the far-right politics of Europe. But at least in Europe, you have a strong information eco-structure. When people found out that the government of Russia was interfering in European elections, I'm convinced that's one of the reasons Chancellor Merkel survived and one of the reasons that Geert Wilders didn't win in the Netherlands. That it turned out there was a reaction. People said, well, hey, maybe I better think about this. Maybe I better think about whether I want to be involved in an inclusive, truly democratic society. Through all of this, and what's happened in all these other countries, whatever your criticisms are, the Irish have never questioned so far that Northern Ireland must be resolved by democratic means, by elected representatives. We see it in America, the rise of these white supremacy groups, anti-immigrant sentiment, attacks on voting rights, and even the integrity of voting. We're having to refight battles we thought we'd won decades ago. Through it all, nobody's questioned that the Irish would resolve this, if they ever did, through democratic principles. But remember this, there is not a country on earth where there is not a limit to the tolerance of paralysis. You cannot stop the momentum of human aspiration, or if it turns bad, human frustration and resentment. Even in a robust economy, especially one formed as ours, the modern economies are, some will do better than others. People will accept that. What they will not accept is that nothing will ever change for them or their families or their communities. It is mobility more than inequality that is the determining factor of the level of openness to us versus them politics. So, here we are. It is quite possible that in the most modern of ages, we are fighting the oldest human dilemma. Since the first people stood up on the East African savanna somewhere between 150 and 200,000 years ago, and people formed families and clans, and there was a legitimate reason when there was a scarcity of food to stick with yours and to believe life was a zero-sum game. All of human history has been a constant movement to define and hold an expanded definition of us and a shrinking definition of them. One of the most popular movies around the world lately is is movie Black Panther. Have a lot of you seen it? Okay, in America it was a big deal for the African American community because it was the first all-black movie that had a huge white audience. For people who loved high-tech movies, it was a great high-tech thriller. The acting was good, the whole thing was good. And for those who wanted to see the disparaging comments about African countries debunked, here was this super high-tech African country in the 22nd century that had a monopoly on a miraculous element, which they then turned into a diversified economy with a zillion different uses. I mean, it operated on a lot of levels. But the most important thing for you to understand is that it was an African morality tale. In the central part of Africa where I first started doing my AIDS work, when people who have no mobile transportation, they walk everywhere, meet each other and one says, "Good morning, how are you?" The response translated into English is, "I see you." Black Panther is what I would call a movie about inclusive tribalism. That is, they're all proud of their identity. But the good guys aren't all perfect. And then at the end, it turns out the bad guys aren't all bad. And they have to find a way to come together. That's what Mandela's whole life is about. He was a Xhosa from South Africa. His family was Xhosa royalty. He came to represent all black South Africans, except the Zulus, but they kind of came along at the end. And then he came to represent all of South Africa, hosting the Rugby World Cup, which almost no black South Africans played. Not only bringing his prisoners his guards to his inauguration, but far more important, he put the heads of the political parties that had imprisoned him for 27 years in his cabinet. He called me one night when we in South Africa, there was 10 hours difference. So I told him to call me late at night. I worked late and at his convenience, so he called me one night. He said, "Oh, they're giving me hell." I said, "Who? The Afrikaners?" He said, no, my people. He said, "Madiba, you had 18 opponents. You got 63% of the vote against 18 people. Nobody on God's earth can do that. And you're putting these people in jail? They kept you in prison for 27 years, and while you were there, they beat us up, they shot us, they did terrible things, and you're putting them in your government?" I said, "What did you say?" He said, "I said, let me ask you something. We just voted for the first time in 300 years. Can we run the banks all by ourselves? Can we run the water systems, the electric companies, the military, the police? Is there one thing in this country we can do all by ourselves?" The answer to that is no. He said, "Maybe someday. This is not that day. And I'm the one that stayed in jail for 27 years. If I can get it over, you can too. Get over it. We got to do this together." The point is, he didn't stop feeling that anger. I told you that already. He just stamped it out. And he made a decision that he would create a country in which what they had in common was more important than their profoundly interesting differences. That's what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was all about. It was about telling the truth and then putting it behind you. That the only way to get even was to prosper, was to thrive, was to prove. And he never gave up on democracy. All of that is at issue today. So when you see this argument of, well, should we do this, that, or the other thing about standing up to government again? What's going to happen with Brexit? In the end, it's still an identity crisis. Don't kid yourself. No one will drop off the face of the earth with any of the reasonable compromises that are being discussed. The only thing that would be calamitous would be to let the whole thing die. To consign yourself to purgatory or go back to hell instead of going into a future. And that's what I want all of you to think about. The only thing that works in an interdependent world is inclusive economics, inclusive social policy, and inclusive politics, and active citizenship. Multiplication and addition work better than division and subtraction in every aspect of social life. And they could best be advanced by free people who believe in giving other people an equal chance and that we should all live under the same set of rules. Because I went to a Jesuit university, I noticed you were founded by Cardinal Newman. I was, needless to say, elated when Pope Francis became the first Jesuit pope. And among other things, he keeps advocating what he calls a culture of encounter. And I believe that. The most fun thing I do now in my current career with my foundation, just pure fun, is a project that President George W. Bush and I run called the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. We pick 30 Republicans and 30 Democrats, equal men and women, all races, all religions, all categories, you name it, and we put 60 people in a group every year. And we take them to his library, mine, first President Bush's library, and President Lyndon Johnson's library, and they study 4 decisions, important decisions made by the presidents. Did we make the right decision? Did we make it in the right way? How was it made? They then take that and spend the rest of the time talking about contemporary challenges. And miraculously, the most diverse group you could possibly draw up wind up reaching agreement. Now, we realize they're in a bubble and they get to go back to their own life and their identities are not at stake. But whenever we meet with them, the Democrats go up to W and thank him, and the Republicans come up to me and thank me. Because they all say, I didn't know there were any people like that. You know, I keep telling people America's a very interesting country now. We're less racist, sexist, and homophobic than we used to be. Our only remaining bigotry is we don't want to be around anybody that disagrees with us. And now we're all laughing about this, but think about it. The Irish peace was born out of weariness of children dying and of lost chances. The further you get away from that, the easier it is to take the absence of bad for granted and to live in this purgatory we're in now. It's a big mistake. There is a limit to the elasticity of inertia, of paralysis. So my position on this is pretty simple. I basically believe that you should celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, not for what happened, but for what can happen. And the Irish Republic can have a big impact on this. You seem to be wired just like this university is. Do you know that Ireland is the only country in the world that every single solitary day of every year since the creation of the United Nations has had at least one Irish citizen in another country trying to help save somebody's life or help educate a child or prevent violence? No other country can say that. When people were dying like flies of AIDS, I came here and I asked the Irish government to commit approximately $20 million a year for 5 years. I said, you pick the African country, but we're going to drive the price of AIDS drugs down by getting the volume way up. Right now, there were only 200,000 people in developing countries on AIDS medicine when we started. There are over 18 million today. Over half of them on contracts negotiated by our Health Access Initiative, and would never happen if Ireland and Canada and Sweden and Norway and a couple of other countries hadn't staked it to us because there was no global fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria. You have a small Irish pharmaceutical company, Adapt, that made an agreement with us to lower the cost of Narcan to help us fight the opioid epidemic and actually give free dosages to every high school and every college who would register and ask for them in the United States. They could have gotten away with just cutting the price. They weren't satisfied with that. There's something in the DNA of this country that has provoked this kind of interest. So I'll be retrospective a little bit at the end. The ongoing struggle to finish the Good Friday Accord and claim its full promise is a reminder of one of the things I try to remember in my life when I've been real high or real low. There are no final victories or defeats in politics or any other frontier of human affairs that depend on culture, conditions, and the vagaries of the human heart. The most important thing is to fight the right fight and to keep doing it. That may well be the defining question of 21st century citizenship all over the world. On that, all else depends. How we think. In his Nobel Prize speech, Seamus Heaney also said of William Butler Yeats that his intent was to clear a space in the mind and in the world for the miraculous. 20 years ago, tomorrow, 17 hours late, everybody impatient, some brave people cleared a space for the miraculous. You should fill it. Thank you very much.